Thanks so much. And most importantly, I was a student under Jeff. So I think I was a CA3.
CA3 when I was a
joined.
junior attending.
Yes. So I did learn some of my anesthesia from Jeff, and it really is a privilege to be here and talk about it. And I'm going to use my slides, but I will tell you, as I was listening to Jeff and as I was listening and talking last night, I'll probably go on and off script to talk more about the ways I'm thinking and some of the things that are changing. I'm very fortunate. The last 3 years I was the chief medical officer and the director of the Center for Clinical Standards and Quality. In that role, I oversaw the care of what it said was 160 million Americans. To make it simple, the Joint Commission reported to this position, and I was responsible for the conditions of participation, the quality measurement program, as well as all coverage decisions at CMS. And in this role, particularly as the chief medical officer, I interfaced very closely with my FDA colleagues, my CDC colleagues, the White House, and others in how we're thinking about, and I will go in and out of remembering that it's only been 4 weeks since I left the agency, and I still get to talk to them because I was the only career staff at the center level, that how I believe CMS, I don't reflect the opinion of CMS anymore, but I also sit on the Bipartisan Policy Center, advising Congress right now with Sheila Burke and Chris Jennings, as well as I just got appointed to the Duke Margolis Center, which is Mark McClellan's center, as well as others, and how I think technology and others would go forward. One of the things that was interesting, both in Dan's brilliant sort of discussions and this racial bias that I'll talk more about later in the program, is it is probably the most exciting and the scariest time possible. So a dear friend of mine, Daniel Kahneman, many of you may know him from Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. We recently had lunch, and I said, where do you think things will go? And he actually is totally fearful because the questions are, can people use the information correctly? Are we smart enough? Will we be hijacked by system one versus really use our system two, our ability to think through, are these algorithms applied safely? Is the technology applied safely? Let's be honest, I was in the world of pre-op evaluation. We still do testing that makes no sense, right? So how are we going to get it right when an algorithm is going to tell us this is what you should do? And just for my disclosures, besides those two I just mentioned, I'm co-chair of the safety work group and on the steering committee of the Coalition for Health AI, which is advising the FDA and working with the National Academy on AI. And these are some of the questions we're dealing with. In fact, on my trip home, we'll be dealing with. I apologize. I'm glad you're all beach lovers. I actually, for the first time in 3 years, I'm going to take some time off with my wife. So I'll be leaving after this. I'm also on the board for health services and the Digital Health Advisory Committee of the NAM. So there's a lot of groups trying to think about this. The NAM is really focused on the National Academy of Medicine on sort of the ethics. The question of, are we violating the first law of robotics? What about patient autonomy? I'm enrolled in a Master's of Law right now, and in our IP class, one of the students brought in the fact that we're creating robots now to provide comfort to elderly individuals, potentially in nursing homes, so an area I regulated. And you have to ask the question, if the robot is there to protect the patient, but blocks the patient from leaving the room, is that a good thing or a bad thing? What's the ethics of what we're creating, and are we ready to answer those questions? And I will tell you, I don't think I am, but these are some of the things that I think we as a society have to grapple with, and given we're techies in anesthesia, what will we think about? We're all familiar with this whole idea of the value equation, value equals quality over cost, total expenditures. But what I like to ask a lot is, from whose perspective? Is this from the patient's perspective? Is this from the who wants better health, the health system's perspective, which I'll be honest, wants less cost. I hope they still want better health. And as we get back to more financial health in our system, what will they be spending on? What will they be focusing on? And we as clinical leaders, at least the clinical leaders in the room, need to really focus on that. And what does the payers and the employers think about? And this is going to be incredibly important. So a little bit of how CMS is thinking about it, at least my perspective today. This has actually been published. Where are they going, at least this administration? And it's to get that equitable outcomes, high quality, affordable, person-centered care. And it's really about driving accountable care. And it's really about, by 2030, 100% of all Medicare fee-for-service patients will be in an accountable relationship. So part of the question is, as we move out of the hospital, and I'll talk at the end about a program I had the privilege of standing up at CMS, Hospital at Home. As we move out of the hospital and you're thinking about that total accountability, what's the right approach we should take to, if we're responsible for their total cost of care, what's the best for the patient? If they're home, they may not need to go to a SNF, but is it safe enough? And what are the right patients we put into? And are we actually going to have some inequities at some point by actually saying, well, you don't have the same level of home as Lee Fleisher has, where his wife is there and everything's safe, so we're not going to do it. Could this actually increase inequalities? Advancing health equity, a goal of supporting innovation. And at the end, I'm going to talk about the FDA, CMS, and where technology. I know there's a lot of companies in the room. Some of you may have heard about a rule that I dropped before I left CMS called the Transitional Coverage of Emerging Technologies, address affordability and the staff. Defining value, and this is something we put out formally, is highest quality. I'll talk more about this. Being safe with the best outcomes, and we really need to recommit to safety in this country. Patient-centered and equitable, as well as affordable. What I was really proud of doing with my fellow CMS center directors was saying we're going to align around a set of measures. Now, it essentially started with the HEDIS measures, which are really the Medicare Advantage measures, the NCQA measures. But this idea that the health system is having a trouble because if you go to any hospital or health system, you're going to find a list of quality measures that is super long, that it depends on the provider. And what CMS and my fellow center directors and I committed to was getting to a line set. And that CMMI, the Innovation Center, would really get to the innovation set. So as you're thinking about looking at technology, my hope, at least for what I left behind and what others are focusing on, is you will know the outcomes to really anchor on. Because there's two reasons that's important. One is to just know them. But number two, and I'll talk about FHIR APIs and USCDI, that the ability to actually do real-world evidence and get to an answer faster will be linked. And for anybody who's familiar with the decision regarding the Alzheimer's drug and standing up the Alzheimer's registry, which was stood up by CMS, what we did was essentially do an enhanced claims registry. We took 10 clinical items, we got the beneficiary number, and we're going to link them and put it into what's called the ResDeck for researchers to actually look at. So there's really this acceleration in real-world data that I think from a technology assessment, people should be anchored around. Now, with regard to value-based purchasing and value-based care, there's really three priorities that CMS is set on. One is growth, and second is alignment. and the third is equity. And in the growth area, I mentioned this accountable relationship, and the growth of accountable care will really improve and promote innovation. Because the idea is not that people, and I'll talk later, what's driving innovation is as you come up with new wearables, the question is not getting paid per widget. And in fact, I have an analog watch. I do not have a digital watch. But not being paid for those widgets, but putting them in a total cost of care environment, putting them in and bundling them to either the physician or the hospital services. So that really the goal is to demonstrate value, not to say, find a reimbursement code. To align around what matters, measures that matter, and because we know if they're not aligned, we won't get there, and making sure there's true equity. Now, and I recognize our colleagues from AHA will go crazy over this, and we tried. These are the number of programs. Now, part of the issue that people need to understand is the way Congress legislates, and I heard the way legislate. I'm not sure all this needs to be legislated. It could just be regulated from putting out rules, is they put out rules, but they don't always harmonize them. And that's why we have so many different programs. And what I think would be really very helpful, Michelle Schreiber and I, the colleague, is to try to harmonize that. You know that there's a lot of work around rethinking the MIPS program. That's some of the work I'm doing at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And how should that look like? But one of the key things for the anesthesia community, for those who are in group practices in which they're measured on whether or not the family practitioner, the general internist, gives a flu shot, that's supposed to disappear by 2028. That we're really getting to, CMS is getting to MIPS value pathways and getting to the subtax ID. Because it's important to measure what people do, but it's also important to let us work together with our colleagues. So one of the goals of that is to say, if you're a pediatric department or if you're a cardiovascular center, you can actually share in the cardiovascular surgical outcomes. It doesn't have to be the anesthesia outcomes. So what are those national quality goals? We talked about value-based, getting to less cost, getting to accountable care. What are those? And these are the 8 that we anchored on. You can see them here, that there's a lot about equity and person-centered care. There's a lot of work that as we look at a lot of what we do, particularly Monty's here, or the prehab, it's about patient activation, to see whether or not we can get them to actually do things. So this is an area that actually algorithms scare the crap out of me, to be honest. Because if you asked who's going to make a difference and you use the past to predict the future, the inequities are going to be huge. Because there will be so many biases built into who we can activate that we constantly need to really evaluate and have that human algorithm interaction to make sure that we don't institutionalize inequities. Safety and resiliency, I'll talk about that in a minute. Outcomes and alignment, I think I've talked about. And I want to talk about those last 2 for a little bit. So I've heard, for anybody who knows Eric Horowitz, he's from Microsoft. He's the co-chair of the PCAST. They just are releasing, I've seen the report, a patient safety initiative out of the President's Commission for the Advancement of Science and Technology. And he thinks AI is going to solve safety. I will be honest, I think AI will both help and actually create more and newer problems in the safety arena. And we, as the scientific community and the clinical community, need to figure out what's the checklist as we implement any of these programs as they come into our facilities. Since all of us work in facilities, it's rare that any of us work alone. And we need to create that resilient system, and that's a lot about the workforce. So one of the things that I believe is really important to recognize is when I'm giving anesthesia on a Friday, and I have the nurses, and I work in the same rooms with the surgeons, and I'm having a difficult airway, they'll just they'll pick up the bougie, they'll hand it to me, and 2 seconds later, we're intubated. But if their staff that has never worked with me, who is brand new, first of all, they're not watching whether or not I'm able to intubate or not. They're actually looking at the computer, looking at their phone. And I'm talking about all the staff. The patient could fall off the bed and the surgical residents, would be doing something else. But this is actually true from last week. I still give, but we need to understand that we are in a different environment. Checklists alone, let me ask a question. I didn't put it on the poll. For those who are anesthesiologists, CRNAs, et cetera, how many think that above 50% of the time, the timeout is real? Everyone stops, everyone is paying attention, and no one is doing anything else? How many think above 50%? I got one, because it's Dr. Tremper, of course. How many think it's 25 to 50%? Okay. How many think it's less than 25%? Yeah, that's Penn Medicine. Sorry, because I saw Patty. And that's with me there. And I keep saying, I can't get in trouble. When I was giving anesthesia and the Joint Commission reported to me, if they come, you're not going to get me into trouble. That's the problem. Checklists in this environment are even less useful when they were before, because we have such instability and people, it's really, if you look at the Michigan experiment and you actually look at the sociology, it was all about team building and creating a culture. And that's what we need to do. My soapbox. So innovation is something CMS wants, it's what FDA wants, but they have very different missions. And I'll talk more about reasonable, necessary, and safe and effective. But one of the things that CMS, I hope, will continue doing, and that the Office of the National Coordinator and others are really focused on, is the idea of FHIR. And the real excitement about FHIR, which is really this fast healthcare interoperability programs, the ability to actually, it's amazing. You gotta love Judy Faulkner. Nobody uses the same basic definitions in any of their EHRs until the ONC said you have to. And the ONC now says that you have to really work on US CDI. And of course, Epic, and I'm sure Cerner, charges you to upgrade your EMR to US CDI version 3. We're on 4. We're actually on US CDI Plus. But the ability to pull directly out, to keep all that data in the cloud at your own center and use FHIR apps, just like on your smartphone, to pull it all centrally and answer important questions is the future, is what we're talking about the national academies. So this is where CMS is going. This is where the ONC is going. This is where I'd actually think people should anchor on. USCDI Plus is actually going to underlie the quality measures and the public health measures. There's a lot of ideas of this idea of standardization of definitions. It's amazing it's taken till 2023 to get to that standardization. It will actually create this learning health system that everybody wants, because the idea would be you could actually benchmark. And I see Jerry Hickson here, who, the best part about that program was the "you are here," Jerry, right? It's saying to somebody, you are here and everybody else is better than you. You're the outlier. That motivates people even more, except for the C-suite, even more than the money. That's what's going to change providers, because they don't want to be outliers. And I saw it every time I took somebody the report that Jerry gave me. So where do I think technology is going? Where are the wearables and what are we doing? And we talk about health technology assessments. There's a lot of definitions. I used to teach technology assessment when I was at Hopkins. And it's an exciting area, and it's an area that I think we need to do more of. It can't just be, no offense to those in the room who have worked with from the companies, that somebody comes in and says, we created this brilliant idea. You know, all you need to apply to the FDA for a breakthrough device is an idea. Not at the very end, it's a breakthrough. It's an idea at the beginning that may improve patient outcomes or address an unmet need. Even if other devices come in before, it's still a breakthrough. And who should pay for that? Should you as taxpayers, if we don't know if it works, be footing the bill through your Medicare tax? Think about that question as you think about, as we come up with new ideas, what should we require to prove that our ideas are good? So you need to do clinical efficacy, you need to do safety, and I think you need to do cost effectiveness, although I will attest at CMS, when we looked at technologies, cost never entered into it. It didn't enter into it with the decision on the monoclonal antibodies. We don't do assessments on low cost to the country items because it's not worth the time given the resources, but the final decision was based upon the evidence. Patients and clinicians, you know, one of the things that, if you read an editorial that I wrote just 2 weeks ago in JAMA Health Forum on the new rule, you know, what do we need to decide whether or not we should apply a technology, which I include drugs in that, to a given patient? Is this the right thing? Should we put the PA catheter in this patient? We were both there when Paul Barish, you know, everyone got him. Now we don't have very few patients get him, but it's constantly evolving. How do practice guidelines fit into it? How do we use drug formularies, the level of coverage and the acquisition in hospital formularies? So I've been thinking about who incentivizes technology and who should pay for it. And I think there really are three different things. And as you think about how you're looking at all this, recognizing this, there's CMS directly or any of the payers that we say you come up with a new technology and hey, you gotta love it. That when Monty, when they came up with the esophageal Doppler, the goal was to get a code so that they could be paid more to place it. It's a good strategy. If it was worth it, I mean, what's the right balance? Do you need to pay more if it's a very cost-effective and useful technology? But that's the conundrum we're in. That's the actual ecosystem we're in. Should it be part of the DRG? And in fact, if you have a new technology that raises the cost, then perhaps, and there is something called the new technology add-on payment, you get paid more. So if there's a new stent and it costs more than the old stent, and it's proven to be good, there's an add-on payment. Many of you in the anesthesia community may know that the facility gets paid more if we use non-opiate narcotics, and a lot of them are actually long-acting local anesthetics. Now, we know what anesthesiology and all those meta-analysis, so should we be paid more to use that? But we as taxpayers are, because the federal government's paying more. And lastly, what happens when patients get involved? You know, CMS can't directly pay patients. Many of us, through our health savings account, can get reimbursed, but it was Herculean to get COVID tests at home to actually be paid for. You can get it in the direct medical equipment. And how do you actually integrate that idea if you're going to send somebody home and it's an algorithm? How does it get paid for? It's actually not clear yet. They're still trying to think about this. So you've got the FDA for all these new devices, who's responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring safety, efficacy, and security of drugs, biologic, and medical devices. And you've got CMS, who by statute has the authority to determine whether a particular medical item or service is reasonable and necessary for the treatment of an illness or injury in the Medicare population. So if you looked at the decision on monoclonals that I had made, that was a lot about in the Medicare population and in a diverse Medicare population, did we have enough evidence, given we know it acts with patients who have different genetic compositions? Is 2,000 patients enough to say that it's reasonable and necessary for all patients, which is why we said in the end that we cover it, but we collect data. Now, you may have seen a lot of pushback. What's wrong with collecting data? Well, we may find it's not that useful in all patients. So as APSF thinks about the future, the more you can collect data so patients and providers can make informed decisions, isn't that a good thing? And say, this technology, let's lean in, and this technology may be great for 10% of the population. And really, that's one of the good things about the unique structure. Looking at devices, the question is, what's the class of devices? Is it risky? And therefore, what's the extent of regulatory controls? So the lowest risk, minimal harm, 510K. It's a lot of devices that are 510K. Some of them are really low risk, like a toothbrush, regulated by the FDA. Pretty low harm. But some of these 510K devices may be a little more, and because they don't need to prove that it improves outcome, they just need to prove that it does what it says it does, and there's a predicate device that is shown to be safe that's already on the market. That's 510K. You have, high-risk devices and moderately high. So the higher risk are all the stents. For the Edwards crowd, this is a lot of stuff you guys did. And the moderate devices are a lot of what we put in the OR. And the goal of CDRH and Jeff Shuren, who's the director, is really to sort of get the balance right. What's the amount of evidence we need versus what's the amount of post-market evidence? So what do you need to approve it? Because we want to get innovative stuff to the public. But we want to make sure if we get it there faster, we're going to do the studies to prove it actually does what it says it does. That's what's going on in the federal government. That's this balance between FDA and CMS. CMS has the authority to do coverage with evidence development. FDA was given some more authorities to mandate that post-approval studies are actually completed. But as you know, it takes a lot to take something off the market. I'll skip over this. I talked about this. At CMS, just to think about technology, there are national coverage determinations. There's about 4 to 5 a year. I'll talk about the new rule. Since I thought that would be helpful to this group, this is what I had overseen. The benefit category, CMS is a defined benefit. What does that mean? That Congress said they can only pay for certain things, different than Medicare Advantage, different statute. So if you have any relatives or if you're on Medicare, you know that Medicare alone can't pay for hearing devices. Medicare can't pay for weight loss drugs. They can pay for a drug that has an indication to reduce heart disease. So all the GLP-1s, if it reduces heart disease, they can pay for it. If it just reduces weight loss, can't pay for it. So it's a very defined benefit category, and they look at the evidence of benefit and the risk of harm. A lot of things, the way Medicare pays, for those who don't realize, is most things are paid, actually everything is paid by the Medicare administrative contractors. It's all paid at the local level. Most things are actually decided on whether or not to pay at the local level. They put out their own decisions, and the only time CMS gets involved, national, is if there's a national coverage decision which trumps local decisions. But if you have a novel technology and you want to get it approved at CMS, this is the process. It is 9 months long. They have to actually accept the proposal. They have, this is in, I think, an editorial I wrote, maybe in this that I'll show you here, in this editorial. But you then have to have a 30-day comment period where people say this new technology should be approved. Then CMS goes into hibernation for 5 months, writes a coverage decision, proposes it. People comment for 30 days, and 3 months later, a decision comes out. And I thought it would be useful, given the timing, just came out with a new pathway to try to make CMS and FDA more aligned. And really the goal is for breakthrough devices. So I just talked about the definition of breakthrough, that for manufacturers, and I know Medtronic's in the room and Edwards is in the room, they were very positive in our new approach, that the idea is you can start talking to CMS a year before you'll get approval. You'll try to get studies to approve for both. And it's still okay if FDA says, we want to get this out because there's enough safety evidence writ large, but there may not be enough evidence for clinicians, for the Medicare population, to decide what to do. So that the goal is to really align those two. This is the pathway. We shortened it from the 9 months to hopefully, and it can be up to, on average, 2 years, to really think through this idea of much quicker and really say we'll stop collecting evidence when the questions are answered. CMS will stop. So I wanted to go for a few out-of-the-box topics, but clearly they're not as out of the box as I think, given some of the discussions this morning. One is in November, I think it was about 13th of 2020, Seema Verma, the administrator, said to me, Lee, we have nothing else, and the hospitals are still bursting at the seams. Any ideas? And I just heard this idea from Doug Clark from CMMI about the hospital at home. For those of you who actually have this, I know MGH has a program, that we stood it up in 9 days. And Congress has just extended it with a request for an evaluation. But the question will be, will patients after surgery who still need to midnight, so they have to meet inpatient rules, and they have the right environment, and the facility has the right people who they can send out, nurses that they can send out, EMTs, they're monitoring them appropriately, they're bringing them back to the hospital appropriately, will they care for them at home? And of course, what will they be paid? So aren't anesthesiologists great people to think about how to take care of people at home in a remote way? So I really think this is potentially one of the futures. The question is, will people do it safely? Will they just try to get paid to do this without all the safeguards? I personally approved every single hospital that got a waiver to be in the program, which meant my team had multiple discussions and mandated things in place and required on a weekly basis reporting to CMS if they had any bad events. There's no other program like that. Where will we go? And where do we jointly, the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation, because there's not many other groups who can think through this, what safeguards could they put into place as they think about surgical care at home? You can try to do medical care, but I think surgical is really a simple place that APSF could make a statement about. And what about digital health? How are all these sensors going to be integrated? What is software as a medical device? So the FDA is out there saying we're going to approve lots of software. I will tell you, CMS has yet to figure out how they're actually going to pay for it. And it's complicated because the question is, what's it for? If you said we've got a scale that has an algorithm that's going to be, and you're a heart failure patient, and we're going to pay for you to buy the smart scale from Amazon, $99.95. Can it be reimbursed by the federal government? Probably MA, yes. But if other people can use that scale, then it doesn't fall under that statutory limitations. So it's not as simple as you think. So as you send things home, are you going to collect them back? Is it part of the DRG, the total payment? If hospitals create predictive algorithms for sepsis, nobody's going to pay separately for that. That's my opinion. Nor should they. That's my opinion. It should be part of the DRG because you should have an incentive. So as we think about these algorithms, the first place is some questions about reimbursement. Is this really part of something else we do? If it's in a doctor's office, can it be part of the payment for some service, which will drive that innovation that we're looking for? We want to really think about leveraging those real-world data. But who owns that data? So I actually was at a meeting with Judy Faulkner, who's the CEO of Epic, and she started telling me how excited she was because during the pandemic, they have a database called Cosmos. How many people know what Cosmos is? Like 2. Okay, Cosmos is a database that Epic has created that takes all the data, de-identifies it, sort of, and provides it to academic medical centers to analyze. But Epic decided that they would start analyzing this data themselves. And if they put 2 data scientists on a question and got the same answer, then they publish it on epicresearch.org. And that's their peer review. So they published a paper, and literally she said this to me, in which they showed that not intubating patients who had COVID was really productive. And the minute that was published on epicresearch.org, the country changed their approach to COVID. Now, Michael, where are you? Mike Scott. You think that was the end? You think that's why people stopped intubating patients? No, right? It's like the anesthesia community and a lot of really smart people. So we have to ask the question, who's getting our data? Do our HIPAA rules really protect us in 2023? Sorry, another editorial. But we should, as part of anesthesia patient safety, I'm going to give you a challenge, think about as we collect all this data, who owns it? The patient. I didn't know that my data was going into Cosmos and she had access to it. Because she actually published a paper that said that women who take antidepressants during their pregnancy have a higher rate of children with ADHD. Now, to me, that's a really dangerous publication that's out on epicresearch.org. Do you want your data to be part of that database? And when I called Bill Hansen, an anesthesiologist who's CMIO at Penn, and said, can I take my data out? And he said, I don't know. It may be part of our contract. You either opt in for all research or no research. Really interesting. Because I think we needed this code of conduct. Really proud of the NAM working on this, the NAM Leadership Consortium. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more in this space. And there's really going to be phased research. And the way the Coalition for Health AI is thinking about this, and then I'll open up for questions, is as we put things out, we need oversight from people. We need to ask the question about health equity in these algorithms. We need to ask the question of if we're applying this to the individual as opposed to populations, are we sure that we have all the safeguards in place? So let me give you an example, because I don't think the federal government can regulate this because it's going too fast, right? By the time they do anything, ChatGPT will be on like version 7. So the question is, if somebody deploys a bed rail, my implementation scientist back there, and they don't implement it correctly, and the Joint Commission comes in because you've had a sentinel event, the question is, did you follow your own policies and procedures? Right? That's the way. Many of you may know they just came out. One of my prouder moments is I actually released after 13 years the guidelines on quality assurance and performance improvement programs, and said the boards need to be responsible. It's a new condition, and it's just being surveyed to now by the Joint Commission. But that idea of the boards need to take responsibility, we as the medical leadership need to take responsibility. And what I think responsible equipment manufacturers and guideline writers need to do is really look at what would the checklists of, and will we deploy them correctly to actually make sure that as these new technologies are utilized, is the information we get going to be integrated with human thought such that we'll actually get to better outcome for those we serve, because that's all that counts. And with that, thank you for the opportunity.
So we'll take some time for a few minutes for questions, because unfortunately, Lee, appropriately so, is going to have to leave and take care of his family. But please, anybody have questions for Lee, comments, great insights. To have an anesthesiologist in that role the last few years has just been great for us. But yeah, please, I'm going to give up the microphone. We have a roving mic.
And one on the stand there.
Thanks, Lee. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great talk. You triggered several thoughts in my brain, and one was when you were talking about cause and effect research, that the case you gave with pregnant mothers who take antidepressants have blah, blah, blah. And that's a classic example of this confusion in research between cause and effect versus associations. Was it the Prozac that caused the baby to have ADHD, or was it the fact that the mother had chronic depression and was taking Prozac? Mm-hmm. Association versus cause and effect, and you see that like every day. I've gotten to where I look at it like through the paranoid microscope. What do you do about that in planning research?
So I think it's more about how do you implement, how do people interpret it, and how do we make sure that as the machine algorithms become more prevalent in everything we do, how do we, the clinical world, make sure we ask the right questions? And I do think the fact that there's not peer review in the classic sense hurts this, but I think that's the key question. And how do we make sure that, we have that appropriate interface? It's great that there are people like Sachin Ketterpal and others who have both insights. We need more of that. But I think we're not going to get away with, there's going to be more and more large data, crunching and saying this is the answer. And there's huge concerns from the community like the Doris Duke Foundation about how that will institutionalize inequities for the future.
Over here.
Okay. Yeah, Joe.
First of all, Lee, thank you. That was a superb presentation. You put together so many pieces of such a complex puzzle that it's a mystery for most of us most of the time to see how the things truly interrelate. So thank you. And I wonder from your perspective, which federal agencies are willing to fund these assessment and solutions for technology use in this complex system? Of course, we know the kind of the verticals or the silos within NIH, and they really prefer disease-focused research. NSF prefers research that in which one proposes something that can't be solved, and then that gets 2 thumbs up. But these really practical, complex system issues that relate to changing our healthcare system seem very difficult to fund. So what are your perspectives on that?
Yeah, from a funding mechanism, that's very difficult. ARC doesn't have much money. Their budget was 1/3 of my budget for my center, and that's their total budget. NIH, unfortunately, the proposed director, Monica Bertolini from the Brigham, would be a brilliant addition. She's a clinical researcher. So my hope is she will get confirmed. There's some issues with your senator, Elizabeth. But ARPA H we talked about. I think they're still searching but I actually think it's the venture capital world. But that, it's been very interesting to talk to some of the venture firms. And what's been funded a lot is apps, and they're looking at clicks as the outcome, as opposed to true improvement, reduction in costs, reduction in readmissions. And I think, I don't know at your place, but I've had enough Wharton MD MBAs who have either never practiced or just finished their residency, who are advising people. And, they may be really smart, but there's a difference between really smart and practicing for 30 or 40 years. And I think we need to, I think there's money there if we can help these companies and these innovators in defining good outcomes that will actually improve health. That's my
Yeah,
goal.
so your short answer is industry, not government, is probably going to see the value, find
But
the business value.
we have to teach them how to assess that.
Right. Thank you.
I hate to
Dr.
come
Tremper.
from the Department of Redundancy department, but no matter how big the data set and how complex the algorithm, it's still retrospective data.
Correct.
Only approves associations. And I don't think prospective trials, since they take so much time and are so difficult to carry out reasonably, will ever keep up with the ever improving generations of retrospective observational. So I think the mistake that Steve brought up, it's kind of frightening that they could come out with these proclamations. Everybody jumped to, well, I should do that now, but nobody ever looked at the actual cause and effect relationship.
So there's a number of meetings coming up with Rob Califf and Amy Abernathy from Verily. I think there's someone here today or tomorrow from Verily. I'm in many of them, and we're really talking about this real world learning lab. And we've got to, as we apply it and try to intervene, collect the data faster than a clinical trial. So I think that's, and people really need to be able to say that doesn't make biologic sense.
Lee.
Yes,
thank
Warren.
you. So we've all been agonizing over the association causation question, but I think the bigger question for us to address here is a statement, not a question for you, Lee, is that these technologies have basically lowered the barrier to entry at the front end, so Judy Faulkner can do science by just torturing a data set until she sees an association and concluding that that's causation. And then at the other end, there's no barrier to going direct to consumer with the result. So she doesn't actually have to publish. She just has to actually get it out there for unsuspecting and lazy physicians and other people to consume. So we've got basically complete democratization of information, but now the requirement to screen the data or the information being presented is passed down to the consumer. So that's our challenge as the APSF, is to figure out how do we get people to realize that all of the controls that made a decent scientific process are gone. And so that you should assume that anything you read is suspect.
So when I was trying to convince the nursing home residents to take the vaccine, it was a very interesting time. And how you frame it matters a lot. Lots of people came up with the idea, we call them healthcare heroes. And my behavioral scientists on this committee that was formed to help advise me said that's crazy because they're still going to work. They're still taking care of the nursing home. So we actually called them community champions. So we actually have to use words more carefully. When Kathleen Hall Jamieson, and if you want to bring somebody up who's amazing, she was the former dean of the Annenberg School at Penn, but she runs a little organization called factchecker.org. And she said every time Fauci spoke, if you actually put somebody who was, let's say, on the right or a little had a different opinion, because he was so dogmatic in the way he spoke, not the way we as scientists heard everything he said. He didn't say anything wrong, but we have all the caveats in the brain. We know the association that the public can find one counterfactual and discount everything else he's saying. So I think as APSF starts to disseminate, they need to learn from the experts of how to disseminate in a way to the public that they can hear it, particularly in 2023 and beyond. Thanks for the opportunity.
Lee,
Sad
thank
I
you.
have to leave.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and your insights.